Jess, I am ready whenever you are.
Fabulous. Thanks so much. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn, Seabird Conservation in Maine. Conservation efforts have helped restore the historic suite of seabird species to the coast of Maine, including puffins, terns, murres, and more. Dr. Don Lyons, Director of Conservation Science for Audubon's Seabird Institute, is here to tell us about their recovery and emerging challenges and to share Audubon's ongoing research and conservation efforts. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Francesca Gundrum, but everyone knows me as Chess, and I'm filling in today, as Will mentioned, for our usual wonderful host, Kathleen Meal. I am a communications manager for Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance, but in a previous life, I actually led whale and puffin tours out of Bar Harbor, and I worked for Maine Audubon's Coastal Birds crew last summer, so I'm very eager and feeling very grateful to be hosting this particular Lunch and Learn. Our organizations represent more than 8,500 members and supporters dedicated to protecting Maine's environment and our democracy. MCA does that through education, collaboration, and advocacy, and MCV by influencing public policy, holding politicians accountable, and winning elections. A few technical notes for today's event. We'll hear from our speaker in just a few moments and tackle questions in the Q&A session at the very end of our program. You don't have to wait though. Please send me your questions through the chat as they occur to you, and I'll keep track of them. And we'll do our best to get to as many as possible during the Q&A session at the end. Please feel free to message Will Sedlak with any technical difficulties that arise. This event is being recorded and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon, along with recordings of all of our previous Lunch and Learns. Thank you all again for joining us today. And Dr. Lyons, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Well, thank you so much. Let me work on sharing my screen here. But it's wonderful to have the opportunity to chat with folks today, kind of share the wonderful seabirds we have in Maine and the work of our program here. Probably most folks know our program by the moniker of Project Puffin. That's kind of been our longest running historical brand. But we've kind of consolidated our activities under an umbrella label, Audubon's Seabird Institute. We're a program under the National Audubon Society that has had a presence in Maine for almost 50 years, working on seabirds and a presence with other activities even longer than that. I'll go ahead and just jump in. Of course, our primary objective in our work is to save the seabirds. And all of that began with an effort to help Atlantic puffin populations here in Maine. But we work with a large number of other species, and I just thought I would touch on a few of those to start. The most abundant or common species is well named. It's the common tern. And we have upwards of 8,000 or 9,000 breeding pairs of common terns in Maine. And it's the most familiar tern for folks on the mainland. It often forages in inshore waters close to shore, is very visible, very vocal, and just a wonderful representative of our coast, along with puffins, of course. Another tern we work with is the roseate tern. And here's an adult. This species is actually listed as endangered under the Federal Endangered Species Act. And so we work very hard to expand the available habitat for this species and promote opportunities for it to nest in Maine. Another tern species we have is the Arctic tern. And like puffins, the Gulf of Maine is the southernmost area where they nest in their distribution. Many folks might know of the amazing migration of Arctic terns. They nest here in Maine and even further north, but when they're not breeding, they migrate south all the way to Antarctica for many individuals, where they hang out on the edge of the ice and catch fish there during our winter or the summer down there. I like to think of them as the bird of light. They experience very long days when they're with us here in the north, and then during the south, during our winter, they're in the south, experiencing the very long days of summer down there. So they perhaps experience more daylight across an annual cycle than any other species. So pretty wonderful anecdote associated with them. We also work with black guillemots. This is another member of the auk family or alcid family, like puffins. This one's a little easier to see. These guys also often feed close to shore, to the mainland shore. And they're known for their distinctive white wing patches, but it may be less known because people have less opportunity to see them out of the water, is their amazing colorful feet. And an even more less known amazing trait of them is that their gape, the inside of their mouths, is that brightly colored red color as well. So you can often find color in surprising places, and these birds are certainly an example of that. Another member of the alcid family is this wonderful species, the razorbill. And again, this is another species where we are at the southernmost extent of their breeding range. The Gulf of Maine is really a special place because it's both a place where many birds of the north extend, but also some birds that are more historically birds of the south also exist here. So we have a wonderful amount of diversity of seabirds, and really are pleased and very happy to work on their conservation here. So our work began at one island, but now spans across 7 islands where we staff summer field stations with young biologists, and both protect and monitor and observe and conduct research on these variety of seabirds. We're primarily across mid-coast Maine, and we work at these sites in partnership with the federal Fish and Wildlife Service and the state Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. They are key partners. They collectively own most of the islands where we work, and are very much contributors to the conservation successes that I'll share with you today. Our headquarters, the Seabird Institute Star there, is located in Bremen, Maine, and the Hog Island Audubon camp is immediately adjacent to that. Probably many people are familiar with that camp. In addition to our work in seabird research and conservation, another really key objective for us is the training and mentorship of young conservationists and scientists. We really want to both help seabirds today and well into the future, and recognize that means we need to energize and empower young people to carry on the legacy of this work far into the future. And we're continually energized ourselves and enthused by working with very young and passionate people, like the folks pictured in some of these photos. And so that's a really important part of what we're doing, is trying to ensure the next generation of conservationists are well armed, skilled, and inspired to carry on a conservation legacy. Another aspect of our work is education and outreach to various members of the various audiences of the general public. We do much of that work at the Hog Island Audubon camp in Bremen, Maine. This camp has been operated by the National Audubon Society starting in 1936, so it's run for 84 years, and is a really wonderful in-residence camp where we conduct day-long and weekly sessions on a variety of topics, including seabird conservation, general birding, and coastal ecology. So a wonderful resource I encourage all of you to investigate, to check out. We work in partnership with several tour boat companies to share the wonder of puffins and other seabirds by staffing naturalists on those boat trips and interpreting both helping to identify species, sharing stories, sharing the conservation needs of these birds. And we share puffins and the other birds much more widely via webcams in partnership with explore.org. So we're really all in terms of both practicing seabird conservation and sharing and educating any interested member of the public on those topics. So I guess I'll dive into the main part of the talk by touching on a little bit of our program's history. And that all started here at this island. This is Eastern Egg Rock in Muscongas Bay. It's a relatively small island. Those blue areas in the middle of the island there in the middle of the vegetation are blue tarps over tents. So this is an island where we have summer researchers and wardens. There's a small cabin as well. And almost 50 years ago now, this was the site where seabird conservation got started in Maine. That work was initiated by our program's founder, Dr. Steve Kress. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that name if you haven't met Steve personally. But he developed the plan to restore puffins to Eastern Egg Rock. There were historical records of puffins nesting there, primarily from the 19th century and earlier. But in the 20th century, up until the early 70s, there had not been any records of puffins nesting there. And so Steve took it on himself to do what he thought would be a pretty quick project to restore puffins. Turns out it was a little more involved. But the project started by moving or translocating puffin chicks or pufflings from a large healthy colony in Newfoundland down to Eastern Egg Rock, where they were reared for 6 to 8 weeks, hand-fed, and then they made their way off the island into the ocean, where they would pursue their fate. Puffins, fortunately, don't rely on support from their parents once they fledge. Once they move into the ocean, they're completely independent. They instinctively know how to forage, catch fish for food, and they can do quite well once they reach that stage. Puffins sometimes take, puffins have what we call delayed maturity. They don't come back to nest for 3, 4, even 5 years. And so the project involves some waiting around for these young puffins to potentially come back. And they were seen relatively soon around the island within 2 or 3 years of the first releases of pufflings, but they weren't coming ashore. And that challenge spawned the thought to try to lure them onto the island itself using decoys. And this photo is an early photo showing a live puffin with 3 decoys. The decoys are the birds with just 1 leg. The real puffin there has 2 orange legs. But once decoys were placed, real birds fairly quickly came onto the island readily. They began meeting one another, and within a few years, there was an observation of a puffin flying back to the colony carrying some fish like this crosswise in its bill. And this was the first proof positive that the effort was a success. Puffins bring back fish in this manner to feed their chicks, and that's the only reason they carry fish like this. So when this bird was seen, or when the first bird was seen, that was proof positive that there was a chick beneath the boulders. The bird in question dropped quickly into a burrow, popped back out a moment later without those fish, and we knew there was a delivery and a chick below. That happened actually on the 4th of July in 1981, so 40 years ago, earlier this month, and we were excited to celebrate that anniversary out on Eastern Egg Rock this year. So following that initial success, certainly conservation efforts continued, and the colony at Eastern Egg Rock remained stable and sustained for a couple of decades, and in the more recent decades, it's grown pretty consistently. So it's still quite a small colony by Puffin standards. We are here at the southernmost extent of their range, and it is a small island with limited crevices amongst the boulders. So we'll never have a huge colony here. We just don't have the space. But it is a wonderful demonstration of a restoration of a seabird, the first documented restoration of a seabird anywhere in the world. And that has really led to an explosion of seabird restoration efforts, both here in Maine and elsewhere. Here in Maine, our own efforts have expanded to include several of the tern species in restoration efforts, both using decoys to attract them visually, but also we've expanded the toolkit, if you will, to include audio recordings, sound recordings of healthy, vibrant colonies of a given species. That's proven to be particularly important for species like terns, which are very vocal. Here's some there. Okay. We've also expanded our work into the production of decoys, of material for these restoration projects. This work was conducted by a company, Mad River Decoy, for decades. But when the proprietors of that company were ready to retire, they very generously bequeathed the business to us. And now this is part of the conservation objectives that we follow, is the production of these decoys for conservation projects, seabird restoration projects around the world. And just to show you a flavor of where this technique, or where these techniques have been applied, this is a map of known restoration projects for seabirds around the world. So these projects, all highlighted by the red dots, are techniques, or use the techniques that were developed here in Maine. They now, it's numbered around 600 individual projects in over 25 countries, and it's benefited approximately 1/4 of all the seabird species in the world. So what started with a very small effort here in Maine has now proliferated into a hugely significant technique and common practice used across the world. Just a few examples of that. A leading one is with the Chinese crested tern. This was a bird that was thought to be extinct for over 60 years, but now there are 5 protected and restored colony sites in East Asia, from South Korea down to Taiwan and mainland China as well, that use decoys such as this bird is standing on in that photo to attract birds to a protected site so that they can successfully reproduce and grow their population. But I want to come back to this figure that I showed you of the colony growth at Eastern Egg Rock for our own Atlantic puffins. You can see kind of in the most recent decade that the growth hasn't always been consistent. There have been a couple moments where The number of birds nesting has even slid back or been flat. And those are actually associated with a real challenge that's looming for Atlantic puffins and many other seabirds. Those were years when we were experiencing here in Maine a marine heat wave, when ocean temperatures were unseasonably or unprecedentedly warm. And that has a significant impact on the food of puffins, those fish species that puffins rely on both to feed themselves and their chicks. The Gulf of Maine is actually one of the most rapidly warming areas of the global ocean. This figure shows kind of the upward trend in temperatures globally across the ocean. That is the blue line, which is trending up, but kind of at a mild slope. But the Gulf of Maine is the red line, and you can see particularly since 2010, the warming in the Gulf of Maine has been very alarming and much faster than the rest of the planet. So that's really having a significant impact on our seabirds here, and is pushing us to really assess those impacts and really understand the impacts on seabirds here to be a harbinger of what seabirds around the world may experience in time. The most important way climate impacts seabirds directly and across the world is by the impacts on their fish, on their food supply. Atlantic puffins here in Maine have traditionally relied on Atlantic herring, which is often called a superfood. It's an incredibly nutritious small forage fish that is the basis of the food web, including for puffins, for other seabirds, but also for a lot of other fish. Striped bass, cod, even whales rely heavily on this very nutritious fish. So that fish has not been in great shape lately. I'll show a little bit of information on that in a few slides, but that has been one of the most important forage fish for our seabirds here. There are some alternatives. Some of these become more common during marine heat waves, in particular the butterfish, the large fish in the left photo on this slide. And maybe many of you have heard about butterfish, but they're generally a warm water fish that's a little more common here in the Gulf of Maine when we experience these marine heat waves. And it's a fish that's very difficult for chicks to consume, however, because of its size. It's very deep-bodied. From the top to the bottom is quite large, and often this fish is just too big for small chicks especially, but even older chicks sometimes to actually ingest, to consume. So it represents, when a parent brings that back to a chick, it represents a wasted effort on the part of the parent, a missed opportunity for the chick. And we're coming to learn that when butterfish are more frequently brought in, that's a signal that some of the better fish choices are just not out there or not very easy for puffins to get. So it's both kind of a unfortunate fish to be brought in and a signal that conditions are pretty challenging. But that's not to say that all the newer fish in the diet of puffins are a bad thing. One fish that's become pretty reliable and quite useful for puffins to raise chicks is haddock. And for those of you who love fish and chips, or to get fish in restaurants, prepared other ways, haddock is a very common and popular fish choice these days here in coastal Maine because populations are quite robust. That wasn't true 20 years ago, but we've done quite a nice job collectively in managing this fishery so that the haddock abundance is quite high, and it's a very sustainably managed fishery now, which is good both for fishing families and coastal economies, but also for puffins and other seabirds. So just to think about the interactions between fishing and predators like seabirds and other species, we've certainly had a significant interest in harvesting some of the small forage fish here in Maine for a long time. This picture of unloading of Atlantic herring on Matinicus Island in Penobscot Bay dates back to around 1900. We've just had a long interest in this species for a variety of purposes. Kind of the most relevant modern purposes as bait for lobster fishing. But definitely we're a big consumer of these fish ourselves. And we continue to harvest forage fish of various types. Here's a large seining operation that targeted Atlantic menhaden, or pogies as we know them here in Maine. But there's certainly opportunity to help forage fish, to manage them well. And this photo represents that really well. This is the alewife run on the Damariscotta River, where there's been significant restoration work done. And the alewife run here is quite vibrant. And this is a fish that benefits seabirds when it goes out into the ocean. So it's an example that we can make a difference if we thoughtfully manage some of these forage fish and their habitats. Okay, that's one thing that Audubon's really focused on. Even though we're a bird organization, we're getting more into advocating for sustainable, thoughtful management of forage fish around the country. In our area here in the Northeast, that's primarily Atlantic herring and Atlantic menhaden, or pogies, but we're working in Washington, D.C. and various states across the country to support the management of forage fish in other places so that seabirds there can benefit. Okay. One other challenge for seabirds that I wanted to touch on today is probably one that is front of mind for many of you, and that's the development of offshore wind. Here in Maine, we have, in the Gulf of Maine, we have a tremendous wind resource. The wind blows very consistently and strong, and we have a desperate need to counter the effects of climate change, to try and limit the amount of warming that we'll experience over the next decades and centuries. And offshore wind is one piece of an alternative energy future that we have to look at. Of course, offshore wind poses serious risks for seabirds, kind of overlapping in the areas seabirds need. Also bats and songbirds that migrate over the ocean. So there are serious concerns that need to be understood and addressed, either through the thoughtful siting, choosing the locations where turbines will go in, or the management of how those turbines are operated once they're in place. The state of Maine has a couple efforts going right now to begin understanding the effects of offshore wind, or possible effects, and how to implement it. The first of which is a pilot turbine effort that there's been a small scale model of a turbine off Monhegan Island for several years. And in the next couple of years, that's proposed to be replaced by a full-size production scale turbine. And that may be as much as 4 miles south of Monhegan, which would put it about 11 miles from Eastern Egg Rock, one of our key seabird islands where we worked hard to bring seabirds back. So we're certainly interested and paying close attention to this proposal. Another proposal is to put in a 12 turbine research array, and the siting for that, the process to determine the siting for that is underway right now. It looks like it's likely going to fall, or the proposed location is around 20 miles south of Monhegan Island, or 25 miles south of Monhegan Island, which would put it about 30 miles from Eastern Egg Rock. And also the next prominent seabird island to the southwest is Pond Island, a national wildlife refuge where we work, and it would be 34 miles from that site. So that's on the outskirts of the range of puffins and terns that nest on these islands, these two islands. But of course, this is just the first proposed location for turbines. If this is successful, as everyone expects, then turbines will become much more common and will cover many other places as well. So we're anxious to start learning about how birds interact with these turbines, especially some of the birds that are unique to the Gulf of Maine, such as puffins, Arctic terns, and others. We're doing a couple things to investigate that, and that includes the careful tracking of where puffins go to forage. We've got a project going right now with a graduate student who's tracking puffins using a GPS tag, which is taped to feathers on the puffin's back. And this gives accurate locations of where a puffin is when it's away from the colony. And this map is some data that's very fresh, right off one of the birds just last week. So we're starting to see, for example, how far puffins will forage from the colony. From this colony, Matinicus Rock in Penobscot Bay, birds are going as far as 30 miles from the colony to find food. So we're certainly, happy to get these data to be able to inform the managers that are considering sites to place turbines. We're continuing that work with some of the tern species. This map here on the left shows the track of a common tern, an entire trip from its nesting island at the bottom of that map. That's Seal Island National Wildlife Refuge, also in Penobscot Bay. But this bird flew to Stonington Harbor to find food and returned in a trip that lasted almost 3 hours. So they can travel quite far, quite quickly. And certainly these kinds of data are crucial to helping us inform the management placement of offshore wind development. So with that, I think I'll conclude and open up things for questions. I think it's really nice to answer questions of that are people about whatever you all might be interested in. Our website for much of our work is there at the bottom of this slide. But I want to thank you all again for the opportunity to share some of our work and certainly the beautiful birds that we have here in Maine. And I'll turn it over to Ches and Will, and then we'll go from there.
Incredible. Thank you so much, Don. And thank you for sharing your vast knowledge of Maine seabirds with us today. And I'm sure I'm not alone in feeling really energized to continue learning more about them and what we can do to protect these vital species and our climate future. So just so you all know, you'll get a follow-up email with links to learn more about the amazing work being done by Project Puffin and Audubon's Seabird Institute, as well as links to continue learning about Maine's offshore wind roadmap process, which we got a great primer from you, Don, at the end of your talk here. And it's a great segue into next week's talk, which is all about how marine wildlife impacts that we'll see from offshore wind. So thanks for sharing that for us. With that, we've got a whole lot of questions. So I'm going to get right to it. And again, feel free to keep sending questions my way. First off, you spoke to how your research projects are involving young people and young researchers, and curious to know what's kind of a day in the life for a young biologist out on these islands, and what sort of gear is required of them. I know hats can be really important for more reasons than one. So we'd love to hear more about what their life is like out there.
Right. Yeah. Our interns and young researchers are really the heroes of our program. They spend all summer out on these islands. They generally don't come into the mainland, so they don't get showers. They don't have running water. They're camping on a seabird island for the summer. We're able to resupply them with food and fresh water every
I'm not sure if this is, sorry, John, if I'm interrupting you. Did we lose him?
It looks like we lost him.
Okay,
He's coming back.
Okay.
Oh, sorry about that.
That's all right. That's all right. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I guess I was saying that the interns and young researchers that we work with are the real heroes of the program. And they are heroes because they live in very remote places under sometimes challenging circumstances, camping, surrounded by many birds, which is a wonderful experience given their love of birds, but it's also a noisy experience. Terns and gulls and other things are quite loud most of the time. And they're working very hard in sometimes challenging weather. Certainly all of our islands received 3 to 4 inches of rain when the tropical storm Elsa moved through. And both the birds and our interns had to weather that storm and then dry out afterwards and get back to work, get back to nesting in the case of the seabirds. So they really are heroes. They're so passionate about the work, about the conservation of these birds, that it's really wonderful to work with them. Very energizing and exciting.
I love that. Yes, I've had the privilege of talking to a few researchers out farther up north, and they have just incredible energy and really care about what they're doing. It's incredible. I'm right there with you. You talked a little bit about this, and I know I sort of know the answer to this question, but how can folks on this call, folks that are interested in seeing these seabirds for themselves, checking them off their list, how can we go and see them in a safe and responsible way?
Right. Yeah, the best and most straightforward way is to join one of the tour boats and take a trip there. There are boats that leave Mount Desert Island and then in the mid-coast from Booth Bay Harbor and New Harbor. They're all wonderful boats staffed with really knowledgeable naturalists. I mean, boats, some have Audubon staff, some have other staff which are really knowledgeable. To see puffins, you really need to have a confident shot at seeing puffins. You really need to get to one of their nesting islands. When they're out for fish, they tend to move further out into the ocean, not come to shore. And they disperse a bit. So it's unreliable to see them away from a colony site. But the tour boats really do a great job. I will plug the Hardy boat, was just a recipient of an ecotourism award from the governor, from the governor's office, and the governor actually joined them for a trip just a couple of weeks ago. So they're one of the tour boats, but they're all doing really wonderful interpretation and sharing seabirds with folks really successfully.
Fabulous. I'm sure I'm not alone. I want to get on a boat right now and go see them. Switching gears a little bit, what are some of the top predators for these seabird species you mentioned? And what are researchers and managers doing to protect the seabirds from them?
Right. Yeah. So we do predator management at some of our islands. primarily because we have so few islands protected compared to what was historically available. And if we lose these this limited number of sites that we have protected, we run the risk of losing seabirds again. So we protect them where they are. They don't have the network of islands to choose from that they once had. But some of the key predators, of course, bald eagles are a key predator of many species, including seabirds. And just by being present on our islands, our interns and research staff are able to keep eagles away. Eagles really don't want to spend time in places where people are very close, very nearby. And so that's quite effective at dissuading their presence. Another common predator right now is peregrine falcons. And it's wonderful that they're back in the system. They're quite able to take birds in flight. Terns are a particular victim of theirs. They generally take small numbers and don't have an impact on the colony as a whole. So we actually don't do any management of them. Another species that can cause a much greater impact is great owls. When they visit a colony at night, their direct impact is small. They only kill a few individuals, but particularly the terns, but almost all the species, if they suspect a predator is coming at night, they will often abandon colony for that night and leave eggs or young chicks unattended. And so that can have devastating effects. So with great horned owls, we live trap them and give them an all expense paid trip to the North Woods, where they are released and released to find another home. We occasionally see one come back. Last year, we recaptured a bird that we had captured and moved 8 years earlier. But in general, that's a pretty effective management technique, pretty benign for the predator and effective at minimizing their impact once we've caught them.
Fabulous. Thanks for sharing that. And I know specifically with eagles, it's such an interesting conservation story, right? Because we spent decades trying to build their populations back and now they're thriving. So it is really challenging. So thanks for bringing that up. A couple questions about plastic pollution. And we know marine plastics, big and small, are affecting marine ecosystems, wildlife. What have your researchers witnessed, if anything? I assume you have witnessed some plastics on your islands, and how is that affecting seabirds and their health?
Yeah, plastics are a pervasive problem worldwide now. Just the plastics we consume here in the US and elsewhere spread far and wide. Certainly something that all of us can do to help seabirds is to better manage our use of plastics, to minimize our use, to reuse as much as possible, and to make sure when we dispose of plastic that it is well disposed of, that it goes to a landfill and will stay there rather than leak out into the environment. Some of the ways we see plastic here in Maine, we see a fair number of balloons actually that land on our islands or have landed in the water that birds have interacted with, perhaps grabbed, perhaps carried back, perhaps get wrapped around their leg. And so that debris really does interfere with the normal activity of birds. But potentially a more serious risk is birds ingesting plastic, mistaking it for a food item, or in the case of microplastics that are so small that they're not visible to our eyes or the eyes of seabirds, that they ingest them unknowingly. That can be a significant contamination risk. And with larger pieces of plastic, it can run the risk of filling their stomach with indigestible matter so that they can't actually feed, they can't actually digest food. That problem has been seen around the world in seabirds, even say with albatross in the middle of the Pacific, nesting on Midway Atoll. Albatross occasionally bring back so much plastic to a chick that the chick's stomach is filled and it can no longer accept real food. And so that chick dies of starvation, even though it has a full stomach. So plastic pollution is a really significant problem. I'll just add that we are working on a research project with microplastics to kind of measure how much of a microplastic load seabirds are building up by looking for microplastic in guano poop. And we're working on that with a fantastic team at the Shaw Institute. So definitely something we're investigating and trying to stay on top of.
It sounds like all really great work. And I'll put in a little plug too. We have some great legislation that was just passed in Maine recently, and releasing balloons in our state is now officially considered littering. And I know I've seen that myself on the beaches and on our islands. So that's a huge problem, as well as all the others you listed, but we are slowly making progress, a drop in the bucket every year. And so thanks for sharing that. A little bit on the lighter side, some of these questions. Do any of the seabird species that you mentioned today mate for life? Do we know that?
Seabirds are opportunistic. Certainly, a lot of seabirds are very faithful to their mates. Puffins, for example, will stay with the mate for years, but they will find a new mate if need be. If, for example, their past mate doesn't come back to the island, maybe passed away, they will switch. If they are repeatedly unsuccessful, they will divorce and try again with someone else if they're having little success raising young. So it's common practice that birds will continue with the same mate, but it's not a requirement. And when conditions warrant, they're certainly ready to switch to try and successfully reproduce in any given year.
Fabulous. Sounds like they've got some healthy relationships that we can all model in our own society. Still on puffins, I've heard legends, and this came up as well, of puffins carrying dozens and dozens of fish in their mouths. So how many fish can a puffin actually carry, and how are they able to carry so many?
Yeah, it's an amazing adaptation, and puffins are pretty unique. They can catch a fish and they can hold it against the upper part of their bill, the upper mandible, with their tongue. So they kind of use their tongue to hold fish in place against their upper bill, and then they can go out and catch another fish. And they can do that repeatedly again. And it's very common for us to see 5, 10, 15 fish brought back in a single bill load is what we call that. But the record, as far as I'm aware, is actually over 60 fish in a single bill load. So I did not see that myself, and it's an amazing number, but they're quite skilled, and I really have no reason to doubt that.
I love that. And just for our reference, because this comes up on the tours when I was leading, people have a kind of skewed idea of how big puffins are. How tall is a puffin?
Well, I can grab a life-size decoy here.
I love it.
So this is life-size, and you can compare it to my body. So they're under a foot tall, but and quite a little bit roundish. You might think of them as the size of a Nerf football, for example, a small football. And they weigh, well, they weigh around 450 grams, which I actually can't translate into ounces, unfortunately. Or I don't know that number in ounces, but so they're modest sized, and an amazing feature for their size. The oldest puffins live into their 30s. So they're an amazingly long-lived animal for their size. That's kind of a unique trait among seabirds in general, but puffins are a great example of that.
Fabulous. Yes, I know I received questions where people thought they were songbird size or huge penguin size, so that's really helpful. A couple more fun, quick questions. Which seabird can dive the deepest or for the longest amount of time?
Right. Well, size helps being able to dive deep. So probably the seabirds that hold the record are the large penguins. The emperor and king penguins probably can outdo anything we have here in the Northern Hemisphere. Of the birds we have here in the north, of the birds we have in Maine, probably common murres can dive the deepest. And that might be as much as 300 feet or even more. Puffins, we've documented them diving here in Maine at least as deep as 150 feet, although most of their dives are probably 50 feet or less. It's a lot of work to dive quite deep. And that's one thing we worry about climate change. Warmer surface waters may cause fish to be deeper in the water and thus be more work for puffins and the other diving birds to get.
Great. Well, not so great. All the more reason to fight for the climate action work that we're all working so hard on. One more quick question before we wrap things up for you. I know this is often a really hard question to answer, but I'm going to go for it anyways. Do you have a favorite seabird?
Oh, that really is a hard question. I worry about offending anyone who has a favorite seabird if I pick something else, but my favorite bird overall is turkey vulture. Actually, not even a seabird, but I just love their biology, their digestive tract, their social behavior. It's all fantastic. But among seabirds, I confess that I started out as a young graduate student working with Caspian terns, and I've worked with them for a long time, and that's probably the bird I should say is my favorite.
Very diplomatic of you. Brilliant. Well, like Will and Kathleen like to say, we run a really tight ship here. So I'm gonna start wrapping things up. But Dawn, thank you so much for joining with us today. I know I learned a lot. I'm sure I'm not alone, and everyone will get tons of resources in our follow-up email, of course. So I hope you will join us next week, July 30th, for a much anticipated discussion about how offshore wind technology will affect the marine ecosystem. And of course, Don, you started this conversation for us today. So great primer. We looked at the intersection of offshore wind and commercial fishing last month. So now it's time to take a much closer look at marine wildlife. Dr. Damian Brady is the Agatha B. Darling Associate Professor of Oceanography at the University of Maine at Orono. So he'll be joining us to share how scientists at the University of Maine are and will be researching the impacts of offshore wind on wildlife and the marine ecosystem. Again, Dawn, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing all of your vast knowledge. And thank you all for joining. I hope we see you next week and you have an incredible weekend.